A strong wind blows through the desert, and for a while Zaid thinks we are going to have another sandstorm. But although no sandstorm comes, the wind does not leave us. It follows us in steady gusts, and the gusts flow together into a single unbroken sough as we descend into a sandy valley. The palm village in its center, consisting of several separate settlements, each surrounded by a mud wall, is veiled in a mist of whirling sand dust. This area is a kind of wind hole. Every day from dawn to sunset, the wind beats here with strong wings, settling down during the night, only to rise again the next morning with renewed force. And the palm trees, eternally pressed down by its blows, cannot grow to their full height, but remain stunted, close to the ground, with broad spread fronds, always in danger from the encroaching dunes. The village would have long ago been buried in the sands had not the inhabitants planted rows of tamarisks around every orchard. These tall trees, more resistant than palms, form their strong trunks an evergreen, rustling branches a living wall around the plantations, offering them a doubtful security. We alight before the mud house of the village emir, intending to rest here during the noon heat. The qahwa set aside for the reception of guests is bare and poverty-stricken, and displays only one small straw mat before the stone coffee hearth. But as usual, Arabian hospitality overcomes all poverty, for hardly have we taken our places on the mat when a friendly fire of twigs crackles on the hearth. The ringing sound of the brass mortar in which freshly roasted coffee beans are being pounded gives a livable character to the room, and a mighty platter piled with light brown dates meets the hunger of the travelers. Our host, a small, lean old man with rheumy, squinting eyes, clad only in a cotton tunic and a headcloth, invites us to partake of this fare. "May God give you life. This house is your house. Eat in the name of God. This is all we have." And he makes an apologetic gesture with his hand, a single movement in which the whole weight of his fate is expressed with that artless power of evocation so peculiar to people who live close to their instincts. "But the dates are not bad. Eat, O wayfarers, of what we can offer you. The dates are really among the best I have ever eaten, and the host is obviously pleased by our hunger which he can satisfy." And he goes on, the wind, it makes our life hard, but that is God's will. The wind destroys our plantations. We must always struggle to keep them from being covered by sand. It has not always been thus. In earlier times there was not so much wind here, and the village was big and rich. Now it has grown small. Many of our young men are going away, for not everyone can bear such a life. The sands are closing in on us day by day. Soon there will be no room left for the palms. This wind, but we do not complain. As you know, the prophet, may God bless him, told us. God says, "Revile not destiny, for behold, I am destiny." I must have started, for the old man stops speaking and looks at me attentively, and, as if comprehending why I started, he smiles with almost a woman's smile, strange to see in that tired, worn-out face, and repeats softly, as if to himself, "Behold, I am destiny," and in the nod with which he accompanies his words lies a proud, silent acceptance of his own place in life, and never have I seen, even in happy people, a yes to reality expressed with so much quiet and sureness. With a wide, vague, almost sensual turn of his arm, he describes a circle in the air, a circle which encompasses everything that belongs to this life: the poor, dusky room, the wind and its eternal roar, the relentless advance of the sands, longing for happiness, and resignation to what cannot be changed. The platter full of dates, the struggling orchards behind their shield of tamarisks, the fire on the hearth, a young woman's laughter somewhere in the courtyard beyond. And in all these things, and in the gesture that has brought them out and together, I seem to hear the song of a strong spirit which knows no barriers of circumstance and is at peace with itself. I am carried back to a time long past, to that autumn day in Jerusalem 10 years ago, when another poor old man spoke to me of surrender to God, which alone can cause one to be at peace with him, and so with one's own destiny. During that autumn, I was living in my Uncle Dorian's house just inside the old city of Jerusalem. It rained almost every day, and not being able to go out much, I often sat at the window which overlooked a large yard behind the house. This yard belonged to an old Arab who was called Hajji because he had performed the pilgrimage to Mecca. He rented out donkeys for riding and carrying, and thus made the yard a kind of caravanserai. Every morning, shortly before dawn, loads of vegetables and fruits were bought there on camels from the surrounding villages and sent out on donkeys to the narrow bazaar streets of the town. In daytime, the heavy bodies of the camels could be seen resting on the ground. Men were always noisily attending to them and to the donkeys, unless they were forced to take refuge in the stables from the streaming rain. They were poor, ragged men, those camel and donkey drivers, but they behaved like great lords. When they sat together at meals on the ground and ate flat loaves of wheat bread with a little bit of cheese or a few olives, I could not but admire the nobility and ease of their bearing and their inner quiet. You could see that they had respect for themselves in the everyday things of their lives. The Hajji, hobbling around on a stick, for he suffered from arthritis and had swollen knees, was a kind of chieftain among them. They appeared to obey him without question. Several times a day he assembled them for prayer, and if it was not raining too hard, they prayed in the open, all the men in a single long row, and he as their imam in front of them. They were like soldiers in the precision of their movements. They would bow together in the direction of Mecca, rise again, and then kneel down and touch the ground with their foreheads. They seemed to follow the inaudible words of their leader, who between the prostration stood barefoot on his prayer carpet, eyes closed, arms folded over his chest, soundlessly moving his lips, and obviously lost in deep absorption. You could see that he was praying with his whole soul. It somehow disturbed me to see so real a prayer, combined with almost mechanical body movements, and one day I asked the Hajji, who understood a little English, "Do you really believe that God expects you to show him your respect by repeated bowing and kneeling and prostration? Might it not be better only to look into oneself and to pray to him in the stillness of one's heart? Why all these movements of your body?" As soon as I had uttered these words, I felt remorse, for I had not intended to injure the old man's religious feelings, but the Hajji did not appear in the least offended. He smiled with his toothless mouth and replied, "How else, then, should we worship God? Did he not create both soul and body together? And this being so, should man not pray with his body as well as with his soul? Listen, I will tell you why we Muslims pray as we pray. We turn toward the Kaaba, God's holy temple in Mecca, knowing that the faces of all Muslims, wherever they may be, are turned to it in prayer, and that we are like one body, with him as the center of our thoughts. First we stand upright and recite from the Holy Quran, remembering that it is his word, given to man that he may be upright and steadfast in life. Then we say, God is the greatest, reminding ourselves that no one deserves to be worshipped but him, and bow down deep because we honor him above all, and praise his power and glory. Thereafter we prostrate ourselves on our foreheads, because we feel that we are but dust and nothingness before him, and that he is our creator and sustainer on high. Then we lift our faces from the ground and remain sitting, praying that he forgive us our sins and bestow his grace upon us, and guide us aright, and give us health and sustenance. Then we again prostrate ourselves on the ground, and touch the dust with our foreheads before the might and the glory of the One. After that, we remain sitting and pray that he bless the Prophet Muhammad, who brought his message to us, just as he blessed the earlier prophets, and that he bless us as well, and all those who follow the right guidance. And we ask him to give us of the good of this world and of the good of the world to come. In the end, we turn our heads to the right and to the left, saying, Peace and the grace of God be upon you, and thus greet all who are righteous, wherever they may be. It was thus that our Prophet used to pray, and taught his followers to pray for all times, so that they might willingly surrender themselves to God, which is what Islam means, and so be at peace with him and with our own destiny. The old man did not, of course, use exactly these words, but this was their meaning, and this is how I remember them. Years later, I realized that with his simple explanation, the Hajji had opened to me the first door to Islam. But even then, long before any thought that Islam might come before my own faith entered my mind, I began to feel an unwanted humility whenever I saw, as I often did, a man standing barefoot on his prayer rug, or on a straw mat, or on the bare earth, with his arms folded over his chest and his head lowered, entirely submerged within himself, oblivious of what was going on around him. whether it was in a mosque or on the sidewalk of a busy street, a man at peace with himself. The Arab stone house of which Dorian had written was really delightful. It stood on the fringe of the old city near the Jaffa Gate. Its wide, high-ceilinged rooms seemed to be saturated with memories of the patrician life that had passed through them in early generations, and the walls reverberated with the living present surging into them from the bazaar nearby. Sights and sounds and smells that were unlike anything I had experienced before. From the roof terrace I could see the sharply outlined area of the old city with its network of irregular streets and alleys carved in stone. At the other end, seemingly near in its mighty expanse, was the site of Solomon's temple. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, the most sacred after those of Mecca and Medina, stood on its farthest rim, and the dome of the rock in the center. Beyond it, the old city walls fell off toward the valley of Kidron, and beyond the valley grew softly rounded, barren hills, their slopes thinly spotted with olive trees. Toward the east there was a little more fertility, and you could see there a garden sloping down toward the road, dark green, hedged in by walls, the garden of Jessamine. From its midst shone between olive trees and cypresses the golden onion-shaped domes of the Russian church, like an oscillating brew from an alchemist's retort, clear and nevertheless full of 1,000 undefinable colors. Beyond words, beyond even the grasp of thought. Thus you could see from the Mount of Olives the valley of the Jordan and the Dead Sea, wavy hills and wavy hills, outlined breath-like against an opalescent air, with the deep blue streak of the Jordan and the rounding of the Dead Sea beyond. And still farther beyond, another world in itself, the dusky hills of Moab, a landscape of such incredible, multiform beauty that your heart trembled with excitement. Jerusalem was an entirely new world to me. There were historic memories seeping from every corner of the ancient city, streets that had heard Isaiah preach, cobblestones over which Christ had walked, walls that had been old when the heavy step of Roman legionaries echoed from them, arches over doorways that bore inscriptions of Saladin's time. There was the deep blue of the skies, which might not have been unfamiliar to someone who knew other Mediterranean countries, but to me, who had grown up in a far less friendly climate, this blueness was like a call and a promise. The houses and streets seemed to be covered with a tender, oscillating glaze. The people were full of spontaneous movement and grand of gesture. The people, that is, the Arabs, for it was they who from the very beginning impressed themselves on my consciousness as the people of the land, people who had grown out of its soil and its history and were one with the surrounding air. Their garments were colorful and of a biblical sweep of drapery, and each of them, Fallah or Bedouin, for you could often see Bedouins who came to town to buy or sell their goods, wore them in a manner quite his own, ever so slightly different from others, as if he had invented a personal fashion on the spur of the moment. In front of Dorian's house, at a distance of perhaps 40 yards, rose the steep, time-worn walls of David's castle, which was part of the ramparts of the old city, a typical medieval Arab citadel, probably erected on Herodian foundations, with a slim watchtower like a minaret. Although it has no direct connection with King David, the Jews have always called it after him because here, on Mount Zion, the old royal palace is said to have stood. On the old city side there was a low, broad tower, through which the gateway went, and a bridge of stone arched across the old moat to the gate. That arched bridge was apparently a customary place of rendezvous for Bedouins when they had occasions to come into the city. One day I noticed a tall Bedouin standing there without motion, silhouetted against the silver-gray sky like a figure from an old legend. His face, with sharp cheekbones framed in a short red-brown beard, bore an expression of deep gravity. It was somber, as if he expected something and yet did not feel expectant. His wide brown and white striped cloak was worn and tattered, and the fanciful idea came to me, I do not know why, that it had been worn out in many months of danger and flight. Was he perhaps one of that handful of warriors who had accompanied young David on his flight from the dark jealousy of Saul, his king? Perhaps David was asleep just now, hiding somewhere in a cave in the Judean hills, and this man here, this faithful and brave friend, had stealthily come with a companion into the royal city to find out how Saul felt about their leader and whether it was safe for him to return. And now this friend of David was waiting here for his comrade, full of dark forebodings. It was not good news that they would bring David. Suddenly the Bedouin moved, started walking down the ramp, and my dream fantasy broke. Then I remembered with a start. This man was an Arab, while those others, those figures of the Bible, were Hebrews. But my astonishment was only of a moment's duration, for all at once I knew, with that clarity which sometimes bursts within us like lightning and lights up the world for the length of a heartbeat, that David and David's time, like Abraham and Abraham's time, were closer to their Arabian roots. And so to the Bedouin of today, than to the Jew of today, who claims to be their descendant. I often sat on the stone balustrade below the Jaffa Gate and watched the throng of people going into or coming out of the old city. Here they rubbed against each other, jostled one another, Arab and Jew, all possible variations of both. There were the strong-boned fellahin with their white or brown headcloths or orange-colored turbans. There were Bedouins with sharp, clear-cut, and almost without exception lean faces, wearing their cloaks in a strangely self-confident manner, frequently with hands on hips and elbows wide apart, as if they took it for granted that everyone would make way for them. There were peasant women in black or blue calico dresses, embroidered in white across the bosom, often carrying baskets on their heads, and moving with a supple, easy grace. Seen from behind, many a woman of 60 could be taken for a young girl. Their eyes also seemed to remain clear and untouched by age, unless they happened to be affected by trachoma, that evil Egyptian eye disease, which is the curse of all countries east of the Mediterranean. And there were the Jews, indigenous Jews wearing a tarbouch and a wide, voluminous cloak, and their facial type strongly resembling the Arabs, Jews from Poland and Russia who seemed to carry with them so much of the smallness and narrowness of their past lives in Europe that it was surprising to think they claimed to be of the same stock as the proud Jew from Morocco or Tunisia in his white burnous. But although the European Jews were so obviously out of all harmony and with the picture that surrounded them, it was they who set the tone of Jewish life and politics, and thus seemed to be responsible for the almost visible friction between Jews and Arabs. What did the average European know of the Arabs in those days? Practically nothing. When he came to the Near East, he brought with him some romantic and erroneous notions, and if he was well-intentioned and intellectually honest, he had to admit that he had no idea at all about the Arabs. I, too, before I came to Palestine, had never thought of it as an Arab land. I had, of course, vaguely known that some Arabs lived there, but I imagined them to be only nomads in desert tents and idyllic oasis dwellers. Because most of what I had read about Palestine in earlier days had been written by Zionists, who naturally had only their own problems in view, I had not realized that the towns also were full of Arabs. That, in fact, in 1922 there lived in Palestine nearly 5 Arabs to every Jew, and that, therefore, it was an Arab country to a far higher degree than a country of Jews. When I remarked on this to Mr. Usishkin, chairman of the Zionist Committee of Action, whom I met during that time, I had the impression that the Zionists were not inclined to give much consideration to the fact of Arab majority, nor did they seem to attribute any real importance to the Arabs' opposition to Zionism. Mr. Usishkin's response showed nothing but contempt for the Arabs. There is no real Arab movement here against us. That is, no movement with roots in the people. All that you regard as opposition is in reality nothing but the shouting of a few disgruntled agitators. It will collapse of itself within a few months or at most a few years. This argument was far from satisfactory to me. From the very beginning I had a feeling that the whole idea of Jewish settlement in Palestine was artificial, and what was worse, that it threatened to transfer all the complications and insoluble problems of European life into a country which might have remained happier without them. The Jews were not really coming to it as one returns to one's homeland. They were rather bent on making it into a homeland conceived on European patterns and with European aims. In short, they were strangers within the gates, and so I did not find anything wrong in the Arabs' determined resistance to the idea of a Jewish homeland in their midst. On the contrary, I immediately realized that it was the Arabs who were being imposed upon and were rightly defending themselves against such an imposition. In the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised the Jews a national home in Palestine, I saw a cruel political maneuver designed to foster the old principle, common to all colonial powers, of divide and rule. In the case of Palestine, this principle was the more flagrant, as in 1916 the British had promised the then ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, as a price for his help against the Turks, an independent Arab state which was to compromise all countries between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. They not only broke their promise a year later by concluding with France the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, which established French dominion over Syria and the Lebanon, but also, by implication, excluded Palestine from the obligations they had assumed with regard to the Arabs. Although of Jewish origin myself, I conceived from the outset a strong objection to Zionism. Apart from my personal sympathy for the Arabs, I considered it immoral that immigrants, assisted by a foreign great power, should come from abroad with the avowed intention of attaining to majority in the country, and thus to dispossess the people whose country it had been since the time immemorial. Consequently, I was inclined to take the side of the Arabs whenever the Jewish-Arab question was brought up, which of course happened very often. This attitude of mine was beyond the comprehension of practically all the Jews with whom I came in contact during those months. They could not understand what I saw in the Arabs, who, according to them, were no more than a mass of backward people whom they looked upon with a feeling not much different from that of the European settlers in Central Africa. They were not in the least interested in what the Arabs thought. Almost none of them took pains to learn Arabic, and everyone accepted without question the dictum that Palestine was the rightful heritage of the Jews. I still remember a brief discussion I had on this score with Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the undisputed leader of the Zionist movement. He had come on one of his periodic visits to Palestine. His permanent residence was, I believe, in London, and I met him in the house of a Jewish friend. One could not but be impressed by the boundless energy of this man, an energy that manifested itself even in his bodily movements, in the long, springy stride with which he paced up and down the room, by the power of intellect revealed in the broad forehead and the penetrating glance of his eyes. He was talking of the financial difficulties which were besetting the dream of a Jewish national home, and the insufficient response to this dream among people abroad. And I had the disturbing impression that even he, like most of the other Zionists, was inclined to transfer the moral responsibility for all that was happening in Palestine to the outside world. This impelled me to break through the deferential hush with which all the other people present were listening to him, and to ask, "And what about the Arabs?" I must have committed a faux pas by thus bringing a jarring note into the conversation, for Dr. Weizmann turned his face slowly toward me, put down the cup he had been holding in his hand, and repeated my question. "What about the Arabs?" "Well, how can you ever hope to make Palestine your homeland in the face of the vehement opposition of the Arabs, who, after all, are in the majority in this country?" The Zionist leader shrugged his shoulders and answered dryly, "We expect they won't be in a majority after a few years." "Perhaps so. You have been dealing with this problem for years and must know the situation better than I do. But quite apart from the political difficulties which Arab opposition may or may not put in your way, does not the moral aspect of the question ever bother you? Don't you think that it is wrong on your part to displace the people who have always lived in this country?" "But it is our country," replied Dr. Weizmann, raising his eyebrows. "We are doing no more than taking back what we have been wrongly deprived of." "But you have been away from Palestine for nearly 2,000 years. Before that you had ruled this country, and hardly ever the whole of it, for less than 500 years. Don't you think that the Arabs could with equal justification demand Spain for themselves? For after all, they held sway in Spain for nearly 700 years, and lost it entirely only 500 years ago?" Dr. Weizmann had become visibly impatient. "Nonsense! The Arabs had only conquered Spain. It had never been their original homeland, and so it was only right that in the end they were driven out by the Spaniards." "Forgive me," I retorted, "but it seems to me that there is some historical oversight here. After all, the Hebrews also came as conquerors to Palestine. Long before them were many other Semitic and non-Semitic tribes settled here. The Amorites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Hittites. Those tribes continued living here even in the days of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. They continued living here after the Romans drove our ancestors away. They are living here today. The Arabs who settled in Syria and Palestine after their conquest in the 7th century were always only a small minority of the population. The rest of what we describe today as Palestinian or Syrian Arabs are in reality only the Arabianized original inhabitants of the country. Some of them became Muslims in the course of centuries. Others remained Christians. The Muslims naturally intermarried with their co-religionists from Arabia. But can you deny that the bulk of those people in Palestine who speak Arabic, whether Muslims or Christians, are direct line descendants of the original inhabitants, original in the sense of having lived in this country centuries before the Hebrews came to it? Dr. Wiseman smiled politely at my outburst and turned the conversation to other topics. I did not feel happy about the outcome of my intervention. I had, of course, not expected any of those present, least of all Dr. Wiseman himself, to subscribe to my conviction that the Zionist idea was highly vulnerable on the moral plane, but I had hoped that my defense of the Arab cause would at least give rise to some sort of uneasiness on the part of the Zionist leadership, an uneasiness which might bring about more introspection and thus perhaps a greater readiness to admit the existence of a possible moral right in the opposition of the Arabs. None of this had come about. Instead, I found myself facing a blank wall of staring eyes, a censorious disapproval of my temerity, which dared question the unquestionable right of the Jews to the land of their forefathers. How was it possible, I wondered, for people endowed with so much creative intelligence as the Jews to think of the Zionist-Arab conflict in Jewish terms alone? Did they not realize that the problem of the Jews in Palestine could, in the long run, be solved only through friendly cooperation with the Arabs? Were they so hopelessly blind to the painful future which their policy must bring, to the struggles, the bitterness, and the hatred to which the Jewish island, even if temporarily successful, would forever remain exposed in the midst of a hostile Arab sea? And how strange, I thought, that a nation which had suffered so many wrongs in the course of its long and sorrowful diaspora was now in single-minded pursuit of its own goal, ready to inflict a grievous wrong on another nation, and a nation, too, that was innocent of all that past Jewish suffering. Such a phenomenon, I knew, was not unknown to history, but it made me, none the less, very sad to see it enacted before my eyes. By that time, my absorption in the political scene in Palestine was grounded not merely in my sympathy for the Arabs and my worry about the Zionist experiment, but also in a revival of my journalistic interests. For I had become a special correspondent of Frankfurter Zeitung, then one of the most outstanding newspapers in Europe. This connection had come about almost by accident. One evening, while sorting out old papers which were cluttering up one of my suitcases, I found the press card issued to me a year before in Berlin as a representative of the United Telegraph. I was about to tear it up when Dorian grabbed my hand and jokingly exclaimed, "Don't! If you present this card at the office of the High Commissioner, you will receive a few days later an invitation to lunch at Government House. Journalists are very desirable creatures in this country." Although I did tear up the useless card, Dorian's joke struck a response in my mind. I was, of course, not interested in a luncheon invitation from Government House, but why should I not utilize the rare opportunity of being in the Near East at a time when so few journalists from Central Europe could travel there? Why should I not resume my journalistic work, and not with the United Telegraph, but with one of the great dailies? And as suddenly as I had always been wont to make important decisions, I now decided to break into real journalism. Despite my year's work at the United Telegraph, I had no direct connection with any important newspaper, and as I had never yet published anything in my own name, it was entirely unknown to the daily press. This, however, did not discourage me. I wrote an article on some of my impressions in Palestine and sent copies of it to no less than 10 German newspapers, with a proposal to write a series of articles on the Near East. This was in the last months of 1922, a time of the most catastrophic inflation in Germany. The German press was hard put to survive, and only a very few newspapers could afford to pay foreign correspondents in hard currency. And so it was not in the least surprising that one after another of the 10 newspapers to which I had sent the sample article replied in more or less polite terms of refusal. Only one of the 10 accepted my suggestion, and apparently impressed by what I had written, appointed me its roving special correspondent in the Near East. Enclosing, in addition, a contract for a book to be written on my return. That one newspaper was the Frankfurter Zeitung. I was almost bowled over when I saw that I had not merely succeeded in establishing a connection with a newspaper, and what a newspaper, but had, at the first stroke, achieved a status that might be envied by many an old journalist. There was, of course, a snag to it. Owing to the inflation, the Frankfurter Zeitung could not pay me in hard currency. The remuneration which they which they apologetically offered me, was in terms of German marks. And I knew as well as they did that it would hardly suffice to pay for the stamps on the envelopes which could contain my articles, but to be special correspondent of the Frankfurter Zeitung was a distinction that by far outweighed the temporary handicap of not being paid for it. I began to write articles on Palestine, hoping that sooner or later some lucky twist of fortune would enable me to travel all over the Near East. I now had many friends in Palestine, both Jews and Arabs. The Zionists, it is true, looked upon me with some sort of puzzled suspicion because of the sympathy for the Arabs which was so apparent in my dispatches to the Frankfurter Zeitung. Evidently they could not make up their minds whether I had been bought by the Arabs, for in Zionist Palestine people had become accustomed to explain almost every happening in terms of money, or whether I was simply a freakish intellectual in love with the exotic. But not all Jews living in Palestine at that time were Zionists. Some of them had come there not in pursuit of a political aim, but out of a religious longing for the Holy Land and its biblical associations. To this group belonged my Dutch friend, Jacob de Haan, a small, plump, blond-bearded man in his early 40s, who had formerly taught law at one of the leading universities in Holland and was now special correspondent of the Amsterdam Handelsblad and the London Daily Express. A man of deep religious convictions, as orthodox as any Jew of Eastern Europe. He did not approve of the idea of Zionism, for he believed that the return of his people to the Promised Land had to await the coming of the Messiah. We Jews, he said to me on more than one occasion, were driven away from the Holy Land and scattered all over the world because we had fallen short of the task God had conferred upon us. We had been chosen by him to preach his word, but in our stubborn pride we began to believe that he had made us a chosen nation for our own sakes, and thus we betrayed him. Now nothing remains for us but to repent and to cleanse our hearts, and when we become worthy once again to be the hearers of his message, he will send a Messiah to lead his servants back to the Promised Land. But, I asked, does not this messianic idea underlie the Zionist movement as well? You know that I do not approve of it, but is it not a natural desire of every people to have a national home of its own? Dr. de Haan looked at me quizzically. Do you think that history is but a series of accidents? I don't. It was not without a purpose that God made us lose our land and dispersed us, but the Zionists do not want to admit this to themselves. They suffer from the same spiritual blindness that caused our downfall. The 2,000 years of Jewish exile and unhappiness have taught them nothing. Instead of making an attempt to understand the innermost causes of our unhappiness, they now try to circumvent it, as it were, by building a national home on foundations provided by Western power politics. And in the process of building a national home, they are committing the crime of depriving another people of its home. Jacob de Haan's political views naturally made him most unpopular with the Zionists. Indeed, a short time after I left Palestine, I was shocked to learn that he had been shot down one night by terrorists. When I knew him, his social intercourse was limited to a very few Jews of his own way of thought, some Europeans and Arabs. For the Arabs he seemed to have a great affection, and they on their part thought highly of him, and frequently invited him to their houses. As a matter of fact, at that period they were not yet universally prejudiced against Jews as such. It was only subsequent to the Balfour Declaration, that is, after centuries of good neighborly relations and a consciousness of racial kinship, that the Arabs had begun to look upon the Jews as political enemies. But even in the changed circumstances of the early 20s, they still clearly differentiated between Zionists and Jews, who were friendly toward them, like Dr. de Haan. Those fateful months of my first sojourn among the Arabs set in motion a whole train of impressions and reflections. Some inarticulate hopes of a personal nature demanded to be admitted to my consciousness. I had come face to face with a life sense that was entirely new to me. A warm human breath seemed to flow out of these people's blood into their thoughts and gestures, with none of those painful cleavages of the spirit, those phantoms of fear, greed, and inhibition that made European life so ugly and of so little promise. In the Arabs I began to find something I had always unwittingly been looking for, an emotional lightness of approach to all questions of life, a supreme common sense of feeling, if one might call it so. In time it became most important to me to grasp the spirit of these Muslim people, not because their religion attracted me, for at that time I knew very little about it, but because I recognized in them that organic coherence of the mind and the senses which we Europeans had lost. Might it not be possible, perhaps, by better understanding the life of the Arabs, to discover the hidden link between our Western suffering the corroding lack of inner integration and the roots of that suffering, to find out perhaps what it was that had made us Westerners run away from that solemn freedom of life which the Arabs seemed to possess, even in their social and political decay, and which we also must have possessed at that some time earlier. Or else how could we have produced the great art of our past, the Gothic cathedrals of the Middle Ages, the exuberant joy of the Renaissance, Rembrandt's chiaroscuro, the fugues of Bach, serene dreams of Mozart, the pride of the peacock's tail in the art of our peasants, and Beethoven's roaring, longing ascent toward the misty, hardly perceptible peaks on which a man could say, "I and my destiny are one." Being unaware of their true nature, we could no longer rightly use our spiritual powers. Never again would a Beethoven or a Rembrandt arise among us. Instead, we now knew only that desperate groping after new forms of expression in art, sociology, politics, and that bitter struggle between opposing slogans and meticulously devised principles. And all our machines and skyscrapers could do nothing to restore the broken wholeness of our souls. And yet, was that lost spiritual glory of Europe's past really lost forever? Was it not possible to recover something of it by finding out what was wrong with us? And what at first had been hardly more than a sympathy for the political aims of the Arabs, the outward appearance of Arabian life and the emotional security I perceived in its people, imperceptibly changed into something resembling a personal quest. I became increasingly aware of an absorbing desire to know what it was that lay at the root of this emotional security and made Arab life so different from the European, and that desire seemed to be mysteriously bound up with my own innermost problems. I began to look for openings that would give me a better insight into the character of the Arabs, into the ideas that had shaped them and made them spiritually so different from the Europeans. I began to read intensively about their history, culture, and religion. And in the urge I felt to discover what it was that moved their hearts and filled their minds and gave them direction, I seemed to sense an urge to discover some hidden forces that moved myself and filled me and promised to give me direction.